for you as an individual, it's a great way to see how your business can really be transformed in terms of how it communicates about itself and how you communicate internally and with each other. So, and to all your different audiences. So I want to take a little bit of time now for Caroline Sarnoff to introduce herself. And again, it's my great pleasure to have her here. We've been working with with Measures for Justice for a few years now. Yeah, it has been a while. So yeah, Caroline, why don't you tell us a little bit about Measures for Justice and what you do there?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited to share with everyone about this amazing journey we've been on the last couple of years creating these training modules. So Measures for Justice is a nonprofit research organization that specializes in county level measurement of criminal justice systems. So what we do is we have a series of performance measures that look at the whole system, right? Arrest to post-conviction. They talk about things like public safety and fair process in the system and fiscal responsibility. And this is really important because we have never in our country really looked at county level criminal justice systems, which is kind of crazy because that's really where justice happens in America, right? It's at the county level. So to do this, you have to really collect a lot of data, which is what my team, the data outreach team at Measures for Justice does, right? We travel around the United States, going county to county, meeting with criminal justice practitioners and stakeholders and asking them to share data with us. So part of how I sort of reached out to you was this idea of how can we help people understand what this job is going to look like from their very first day. And that's really my role at Measures for Justice, is to oversee data collection across the entire United States at the state and county level. To help populate our measures. And we really hope that that practitioners and the public alike will use the Measures for Justice data portal to really, as the first step for an informed decision about what's happening in the criminal justice system.
Great. Thanks for that intro. And of course, we're gonna go into a little more detail about that and specifically that role about you looking at how do we prepare these new hires as best we can, right? Yeah. And so I just want to go through a couple of the discussion points here, and I'm just we can just put them all onto the screen at the same time, Kaija. And so, just really in a couple of brief sentences, what we've summarized here, and what I would like to talk about today with you, Caroline, is, essentially what we found from our perspective at Narrative, we sort of see storytelling as a great way to communicate messages in a very memorable way. And the reason that we do is because our brains are actually wired for stories. So we kind of know from a very young age that that's how we understand the world.
Right.
We're told stories as children, we tell stories to our children, etc., and immediately it kind of creates coherence. And so for us, I think when Measures for Justice approached us, and we started talking, the two of us, I sort of quickly had this idea that, well, we could, what are the stories that are worth sharing and that would really illustrate or highlight what it is like to be doing this job? Because you had been there for a while, and for a while it was just you, right?
Correct. Yeah. I've been there for a couple of years, and I had like this very fluid, non-structured way of training, quote unquote, training people. So we were really at a point where we needed to formalize that process.
Yeah. And so, so that's really when we started to think about, well, from my perspective, well, what are the stories that you have, Caroline? What are all these experiences that you've had on the road, going all to these different counties and stakeholders, and sort of what were the different kinds of scenarios that you came across that potentially would be likely for a new person to come across, right?
And you and Narrative were great at sort of mining those stories. I don't think I even realized how tangible those stories were and how much they could inform the work that my team was doing. So that was great. You helped me sort of understand how just telling a story could create something really useful.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think, rather than going through all these discussion points, we might as well just discuss.
No, sure. Go ahead.
It's kind of show, don't tell, right?
Yeah, no.
So Kaija, if you want to switch up to the screen and so that people can see us, I think this is a good time for us to just say hi to everyone.
Mhm.
And of course, I just want to remind everybody who's listening that we will share these discussion points with you all, and we'll add to it as we see, what emerges here, because I want to go off of this topic that you were just talking about, because I think there's a few steps, right? When you're
Mhm.
thinking about onboarding, is first about what have you been doing so far, right?
Yeah.
And so what was your process? So what was that process for you guys?
Sure. So the process was very fluid, right? So I had been at Measures for Justice for about 2 years, and I was sort of going out alone to all of these counties, having meetings. And we realized it wasn't really sustainable for just me to do this.
Mm.
So then I hired, maybe one or two extra people, and we tried bringing some people from our research team out on trips with me. And basically, it wasn't a really effective training tool because I was just sort of saying, okay, come with me,
Mm.
just shadow me, sit with me over the course of, 4 or 5 meetings. I'll give you some materials, and then, you're ready to go.
Yeah.
So it wasn't very effective and it wasn't very efficient. And as Measures for Justice kept growing, and I went from hiring one person to, it's probably been about 8 or 10 people over the last few years. We just realized, listen, we need something with a little more structure here if this is really going to be an effective, training process.
Yeah, and I would imagine it's if you're growing at a fairly fast
Yes.
clip, it's not really
Mhm.
sustainable to have people shadow you all the time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Like it just wasn't that couldn't happen anymore.
Yeah.
Now when we hire someone new, it might take, a couple months before they go out and shadow someone.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
we,
yeah.
we needed something to kind of help them understand before they were actually out there.
Right. And so, and what I should say also, just in terms of context, is that the narrative had been involved with Measures for
Mhm.
Justice on a kind of messaging presentational level, right?
Right.
So I had done quite a lot of work with Amy Bach, who's the founder of
Mhm.
Measures for Justice, the president of Measures for Justice, but really around, what does Measures for Justice do?
Right.
What's memorable about it, and why should people care about it, really?
Yeah.
And then when you came along, it was kind of interesting because you didn't start the company, but you
Yeah.
started pretty.
Yeah, definitely.
How long ago has it been?
So
How
it's
long has it been
been
now?
over 4 years since I've been working with Measures for Justice, and
And
I was the first one to sort of go out on the road and
yeah.
do this really county level intense data collection.
And so when we were talking about your experiences in the field, so to speak,
Yeah.
and you were saying, that what was interesting about the process was sort of mining the
Mhm.
stories together, because I remember that,
Yeah.
us spending a lot of time in an environment kind of similar to this one.
Yes, a little sound
Yeah,
booth.
sound booth, exactly. And I was asking you a lot of questions.
Mhm.
But I think it'd be interesting for people who are listening to this and watching this,
Mhm.
what that process was like for you. Like, what are the and I don't know if you can share perhaps an example of a typical situation that
Yeah.
maybe you hadn't thought of in a long time,
Yeah.
but that became sort of central, a kind of central learning tool for others without divulging confidential information, obviously.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think, first of all, I should say a little bit about the data outreach
Yeah.
role, that it's really completely unique, right? So even if when we've had employees who have worked in the criminal justice field before, or they might be attorneys, no one is prepared for this role because it doesn't really exist anywhere else.
Mm.
And the challenge was like, how do you train someone for something they've never done without them actually going and doing it?
Mm.
And the way we were doing it was sort of like, okay, you're just like thrown into the fire from the very beginning. And I wanted a way for people to understand what it meant to be part of the data outreach team without having to go out there, which is why these stories were so important, right?
Mm.
So from the very beginning, they could start to envision, like, this is what a day at my job is going to look and feel like.
Mm.
And that's really important when you
Yeah.
have a job that someone can't always visualize. And as part of you helping me mine those stories, I think for me, I didn't realize there were themes.
Mm.
Right. So I was just sort of going through the motions, right? I'm having meetings every day, and I wasn't able to sort of zoom out and
Mm.
realize that there are themes through these meetings and typical scenarios that I could be passing on fairly easily to new people on the team.
Mm.
Right. Like I'm thinking, oh, they just have to learn it by sitting through these meetings, but actually there were some pretty clear themes that you
Mm.
helped establish. And then we were able to create this training structure that is a series of stories based on those different scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
And that was very useful, I
Yeah,
think.
yeah. And I remember one particular challenge, that stuck out for me, because this is kind of what we look for, right?
Mhm.
And especially when you're going to train someone, is what are the challenges that you're
Oh,
likely,
yeah.
right? It's a little bit like a pilot getting trained, and
Right,
you have
right.
to
Like
learn
worst
through
case
the what's the
scenario, kind of.
turbulence going to be, and what
Yeah,
do I do when
totally.
there's turbulence? Do you have like an example of that
Yeah.
that proved to be helpful to people?
No, definitely. So one of the stories that we talked about was a state attorney, which is like a district attorney
Mm.
in sort of a conservative county in Florida, who had it was just an interesting meeting. He was a really powerful figure. He was a former judge, so you could tell he obviously had a lot to say. He was going to have a lot of opinions. And I walked into that meeting, and basically it was an example of how we went from someone being very against measures for justice and against data-driven work
Mm.
to within an hour being able to switch that meeting
Mm.
to him saying, okay.
Mm.
And that story always sticks with me because it was a great example of how, you can't give up,
Mm.
right? Because when you're in the room with a prosecutor or a judge, like, of course they're going to play a little tough,
Yeah, yeah.
it's just their personality. And if you can be polite and persistent and really clearly state what your goals are for being there and kind of hang tough, you might end up turning the tide a little bit in a single meeting.
Yeah.
So that was a really key lesson that we always talked about, was this one really tough meeting that, we ended up getting the data.
Yes.
Even though he sounded like he hated us when
Yeah,
we
yeah,
walked
yeah,
in.
yeah. And it's interesting because I still remember. So we're talking about a training that occurred a year and a half or 2 years ago at this
Right, yeah.
point, right? And I still remember some of the details of what
Yeah.
the rooms looked like.
Of course,
I remember
yeah.
one person. I don't know if it was this one or not, but who had a fish
on the wall.
on the
Yeah,
wall, yeah,
that was him.
and yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
that was him.
That was
And
him. Yeah.
and what people actually said to you and what you
Mhm.
said to them, and it's in those little nuggets of dialogue between you and these counterparts, these stakeholders that people meet, that we were really able to find these lessons, right?
Mhm.
I think
Yeah.
without those details that seem to you probably kind of mundane, it's like,
Right.
well, why do you need that level of detail, or why do you need
Mhm.
to know exactly what they said to me and what you said to them? And I think for me, the reason is that it's there that you find the most information,
Mhm.
actually, that's really kind of memorable information, but also these lessons that we derived from
Mhm.
these stories, like the keep at it, and keep the
Mhm.
faith, etc. If there isn't something to actually prove it, to prove, well, why should I keep the faith,
Yeah, right.
well, here's an actual story, and I believe it because you're giving me details
Mhm.
of things that could have only happened to you,
Right.
and in your experience. So
Yeah.
that's kind of an interesting, I think one of the ways that storytelling really helps to bring
Yeah.
something out that's more memorable.
Right. The stories bring out the nuances,
Mm.
right? Because if I was training someone on a meeting, I wouldn't probably say, remember to look at your surroundings. Is he a
Mm.
military man?
Right.
Like, I probably wouldn't say that. But when
Mm.
I tell a story
Mm.
and I mention that I'm in a small back room, or, he has badges on the wall, it's letting you know that I am cognizant of my surroundings. So you probably should be too when you're in
Mhm.
these meetings.
Mhm.
So it's a really like practical way of teaching those sort of skills.
Right. So
Mhm.
you're breaking down what you're hearing, in terms of what happened in these situations,
Mhm.
and by breaking down what happened, then you actually get nuggets of information that you can then pass on to others.
Right. Yeah.
And
Totally.
that's really essentially how this training worked, right? So we mined the
Yep.
data from you
Uh-huh.
by hearing your stories, and then do you want to talk a little bit about what happened next? Like, what was
Yeah.
the process of sharing all that?
Yeah, it was great. So we created sort of podcast style, right? I think there's about 8 of them, different training modules, and they each represent a typical scenario that you would encounter along the way. And then we followed that up with an amazing in-person training session. So everyone listened to those podcasts, And then we sort of worked with everyone on how to sort of tell their own stories so that they would feel comfortable not only sharing stories internally about what they experienced, but also would be really comfortable when they had these meetings with criminal justice stakeholders talking about measures for justice and sort of telling a story about why measures for justice matters and why data matters. And they could do this in sort of a short clip and effectively communicate what they needed to in story format, because we know that resonates with people on the road.
Yeah. And what do you think was the impact on the people that were sort of in these new positions, and
Sure,
looking back on it, I guess?
I mean, one big thing for me is that I think it was a very practical way for them to understand what was going to happen without having to be thrown in right away. And then it just created a great culture of openness, I think, right away. Because here I am, at the time I was the assistant director, but, the director being really candid about success, but also about failure. And, saying, this was horrible, but I learned from it. So I think it allows people to say, oh, so sometimes it's going to be horrible. I heard Caroline talk about her failures and her successes. So now I feel really comfortable sharing my failures and successes too. And I think that has been the biggest takeaway is from day one, we've created this really open atmosphere where it's acceptable and encouraged to tell your stories about what's happening every day as a team.
And then for you, so you said, you went from assistant director to director, and now, how do you see this sort of evolving? Because now we're involved to create a kind of a 2.0 version of this.
And for me, that's just like a big takeaway whenever you do training. Is one of the things I've learned is like you need to be ready to like really adapt to what the training needs to be. And I found that we're evolving, because when we started these meetings, there was sort of a little less at stake. They were sort of a little more ad hoc, maybe here and there. We were still developing our data portal, which is now live. No one knew about us. We were very under the radar. And what's happened over 2 years is, first, we've just grown super fast. We now have a live data portal. So when we ask for a meeting, we're not really going in under the radar anymore. Everyone knows who we are, right? So we need to come in a little more prepared. We have standard messaging that we didn't have 2 years ago. So it's just, it's great. This is part of a growing organization, right? We have a lot of foundational messaging and structure that we didn't have. And standard operating procedures, like all this stuff didn't really exist 2 years ago. So the new training now is like, okay, how can we increase, how can we add more stories that talk about really core messaging, the very basic things that we want people to get out there. Not only are we just training about scenarios you might encounter, we're also using stories to train about measures for justice.
Right.
And so the foundation of measures for justice.
Understood. And so that sort of consistency of messaging is also going to be part of this new training. It's like, how do I speak about measures for justice in a way that I can own myself and that's personal to me, but also hits on the points that you want to hit, right? Yeah, and it's also, we're evolving so that it's just not my stories. Now we have a team of a lot of wonderful people who have been on just as many site visits as I have, and have also really, really valuable lessons to be shared. So we're incorporating other members of the team into our training, our onboarding, so they don't just hear my voice, but they hear other voices. Right, that's really interesting. And I think we have a slide that'll be shared after this, or maybe we can put it up on the screen now if that's possible. But I'll just describe it as sort of this cycle of learning, right? So as you described it, you kind of start with, well, what are the stories that one person has? One stakeholder in the company, and that's kind of let's call that person, well, it's you obviously, but in this case, it's kind of the knowledge holder, right? So there's someone who's got that knowledge. And then we mine that knowledge through the stories that you told, and we kind of derive lessons and information from it, and then we shared it through these podcasts, and now we're using video for this new one as well, and we'll see what that does in terms of delivery of training. But and then once you go through that, then other people start to add their voices to it, right? That's the cycle. Yeah, and it's just such a so the whole thing with being a director and then maybe having people at your training or people who work for you is it's really natural for them to tell you a story about what happened, right? Because these meetings, we're all over the United States, we're meeting
really interesting people. Like, it's so natural to want to call someone and be like, you're never going to believe what just happened.
Yeah.
Right. So we're constantly actually telling stories and,
Yeah.
and sharing these experiences with each other. And it's like, okay, let's get them down. Like, let's make this a tool. Like, that was
Yeah.
really, really interesting, and it will be really informative for someone else down the line.
Right. That's a great point. So, so you're actually kind of leveraging something that happens informally, probably in a lot of companies.
Yes, exactly.
You're right. I mean, yes, that's something that I see in my company, but also in previous, in previous experiences that I've had in the corporate world, especially where, you're kind of, you meet someone in the elevator and you're like, oh, what have you been up to? And well, here's the project that I'm working on. Let me tell you about this crazy thing that happened and that I learned from. Right.
Exactly.
And so instead of having that limited to a short conversation that only two people hear from, you're actually sharing that with the entire organization.
Right.
And then every time someone comes in, they get a chance to hear and learn from that.
Yeah, and build that institutional knowledge.
Yeah.
The thing with an organization like Measures for Justice, that's a nonprofit that's had a huge impact over 4 years. It's like, how do you take someone who's brand new and bring them up to speed on like everything that's happened over the last 4 years, and get them to have that institutional knowledge so they feel like they have ownership of their role immediately, and they have ownership of the mission and the messaging. And I think that's by giving them a chance to hear everything that's happened previously.
Yeah, that's great. So, we've talked about culture and sort of the impact of that on it. Do you have a sort of a sense of, almost 2 years later, doing now a new training version of this, you've got new people coming in and who haven't, or who have, I guess the thing I should say also is that people have access to these stories now in a kind of a permanent way, right? So they can hear you at any point in time, and that's now part of your onboarding process for someone who comes in, walks into the door last week. That's what's happening.
Yeah.
And so what have you noticed about the people that do go through this training or have gone through it maybe a little while ago, but sort of how have you noticed the benefit of training people like that, even if it's anecdotal way or some.
I have one really practical benefit that it might not affect everyone, but my whole team telecommutes. So I live in, outside of New York. I have someone in Michigan, I work in Missouri, Washington, California. So for me, there's a really practical benefit is like we sort of get to know each other, even though we haven't met each other. So for some of these people that I'm working with, it'll be like months before I sit down and see them in person. It's not like we're going to the office every day and we're having a cup of coffee and I might think, oh, this reminds me, I want to tell you about this time, because I think you might find it really interesting. So it allows people who are brand new to the team to get to know me. And that's like a very practical benefit for me, right? So they're hearing me talk about something that's really intimate, something that's sort of vulnerable, these stories. And then from right away, they kind of know who I am. And so they probably feel really comfortable, reaching out to me because they've heard me talk so much, right? It's like, if you watch a reality show like every day for a year and then you see the person on the street, you'd be like, oh, hey, I know you. You just feel like you know them because you've heard them talk and hear their stories. So that's been really great for me. So that's a benefit. Is that good?
That's absolutely, that's great.
Yeah.
And so well, I think this, we're about 32, 33 minutes in. I think this might be a good time for questions for 10 or 15 minutes, unless you've got anything else you want to say before
I was just gonna
maybe we can
say,
set it up and
you had, when we were sort of talking about this and things we might discuss, you sort of said like, what are some advice you would give to someone who's building like a training or onboarding? And I think the big one, it was just to not be afraid to put some standardized training exercises and materials together. I was again, like I said, it was really fluid. I wanted it to feel organic, and the feedback I was getting were that the new employees didn't want it to be fluid and organic. Like they wanted some structure, they wanted training materials, and and I used to be sort of resistant to that, and now I'm really thankful that I've been able to lean on my managers who've created great additional training materials besides the stories. We're investing more time to augment the training we do with narrative, to add more. So like I would just really say it's worth sort of the time and effort to create standard structured training processes and onboarding. across the board, right?
Yes.
Sure, HR and everything, but also
Yeah.
institutional.
I'm glad you brought
knowledge.
that up because I feel like that's such a great point. That it doesn't really matter what you do or what industry you're in.
Mhm.
That this is such a kind of it's good across the board no matter what you do, because
Totally.
if you have a team, then
Mhm.
you need to train them,
Right.
and so yeah, how do you? I think one of the big challenges in corporate America, or any business for that matter, whether it's nonprofit or corporate, is that how do you kind of reduce that time, that learning curve,
Mhm.
and how do you put in place systems that help to make
Yeah.
someone feel like they belong from day one,
Totally.
and like they know you, or like
Yeah.
they know the rest of the
And
team.
that's a culture thing. I've
Mm.
worked at other really large, like corporate research organizations,
Yeah.
and the training process is they drop, hundreds of pages of reading
Mm.
on your desk, and they say, okay, we're working on these 5 grants. I need you to get up to speed.
Mm.
Right? No one sits down and tells you the
Mm.
background and gets you sort of really feeling it. You just get read in. You just literally read.
Mm.
And that's your training.
Yeah.
And I found that really lacking as being like a holistic approach to bringing someone on board.
Yeah. What was the part that was lacking to you? Is it a sort of a human side, or is it?
Well, it's just boring too.
Right.
It's like you've got a new job, you're wanting to, be engaged and show that you're here and you're ready, and then you're in your office all day reading for 2 weeks. Like
Yeah.
it's a couple of hours of listening to stories, and then you might be able to have a fun conversation about those stories and what you learned, instead of saying, oh no, I'm only on page 50 of 100 of the grant report.
Right. Got it.
You know.
Got it. Yeah. That makes sense. Well, let's see if there are any questions that people have. And again, you can use the chat box that is on the Zoom software, and just put in your question there. And I guess, Kaija, you can tell us what those questions are, and maybe we'll repeat them so that people know. You should be able to see that on your screen, and just type in whatever you like. We've talked about a few different things, and I'd be interested in if people want to share either some of their onboarding experiences or some of their challenges that they're facing, and perhaps how, reflect on how this conversation that we've been having may help or support you in your own process. And maybe as we do that, Kaija, we could put up our contact information if people want to know how to contact Measures for Justice, or how to contact Narrative as well. So any questions that we've got?
We don't have any yet.
Okay, good. Okay, so we'll just wait for those to come in, and we're going to share contact information. So you're going to see our PowerPoint presentation that should be coming back onto your screen momentarily. One of the things that I just wanted to add to the mix here is, we've been talking about culture. Obviously, we've been talking about, how do you prepare new people for a job? The other thing is, and you've talked a little bit about, as a leader, that you sort of felt the impact in terms of people getting to know you, and how they're thankful for that. And then, of course, you were thankful as a leader to have a structure instead of this fluid, organic thing that at first you were kind of comfortable with, I guess,
Right.
Because that's the way you were doing things.
Well, and it's also about being self-reflective. Like, just because I liked it didn't mean it was right? Like, I liked it because it wasn't a ton of effort for me, right? Like, I just brought them along and it was great. But the feedback was that the employees weren't getting training that was useful for them, right? Like, they needed more.
Yeah. That's interesting. So let's see, any questions coming in, or not yet so far?
Yeah, there's one question.
Okay.
Have you done anything else with the stories you've gathered, and have you used them for other purposes?
Oh.
Yeah. What do you?
That's a great question. So kind of. So originally we just recorded them for my group, right? So data outreach, there's like 5 or 6 of us. Now there's 8. But Measures for Justice, we have, including consultants, anywhere up to 40 team members, which, 4 years ago, there were like 5 of us.
Wow. Yeah.
So it's also, remember I was talking about, like, data outreach is sort of a hard job to wrap your mind around. People are like, what do you do? So it's also great to use internally outside of data outreach, to have other members and other staff at Measures for Justice understand what this role is like.
Yeah.
So they might have some, empathy or understanding about what people who are collecting data go through every day. And that's great for research, because research just gets gets the data and cleans and codes it, but they might not understand everything that went into it, the blood, sweat, and tears to get people to share the data with us in the first place. So we have really shared them throughout the entire organization, which wasn't initially the goal. And I think that's it. We haven't put them out, but this new training that we're doing, we might share them externally with funders.
Right. Yeah,
I think funders, because Measures for Justice is 100% foundation funded, and it's a great way to sort of share with funders or potential funders the sort of work we're doing and our messaging and that kind of stuff. I think that could be a really useful tool.
Sure. Yeah, because I know that from my perspective, the stories that I'm hearing, could very well be used in an external way. I think, it's an interesting question because you really have to think about who your primary audience is going to be for any story that you're going to tell.
Yeah, totally.
And one of the things that we think about a lot and is one of the steps of our methodology is, why am I telling a story and why now? And
Right.
sort of, and as opposed to just, I'm going to tell a story because I know it works, and I'll just tell a story to everyone, and I'll just keep telling the same story to everyone and expect the same results because a month before I was able to raise funds, using that story, but then a month later it's a different audience. It doesn't work as well, and so I think it's important to also think about who that audience is and who these stories are for. And because we had this sort of very internal facing goal and purpose, we really thought about what's the best way. First of all, what are the best stories to share with people that are really going to be helpful for this purpose? And then what's going to be the best way to deliver those stories, again, for that specific purpose. And having had that, from my perspective, having had that experience, it's only 2 years later when we had that, we've now had this experience that we could think, what, some of those stories maybe could be used externally. And so now we're thinking about perhaps a different purpose, but still keeping the priority as onboarding, and this is why I'm using it, right?
I mean, that's what it's for.
Yeah, exactly. But you could, as we're going along the process, I could very well see how some of these stories are an amazing way to say very, very specifically what you guys do, because you're telling us stories about things that happen in the field with the audiences that you work with, and you're talking about some of the challenges that happen and how you overcome those challenges. So, which could be very interesting for a funder, to know about.
Everyone
your
loves
process.
an underdog story.
Right, exactly. And yes, and it's true. And I should say that I think the first time I met the founder of Measures for Justice was probably 6 years ago.
Yeah, that's great.
Where it was just one person, and I think you came on board pretty quickly after that. And she was fundraising. We were just working on her pitch at that time, and we got the pitch story, and then from there, you guys grew, and our involvement with you guys grew. So the purpose, from my perspective, went from purely external. How do I represent what I do and what this idea is, because that's what it was 6 years ago. And now we're here and it exists in the world, and so how do I represent that to my people, so that they can understand how to use it. So got another question coming in. I hope that answers the question. I think it does.
The next question is, you mentioned changing the culture and openness. Do you think it has changed the culture any other ways?
Yeah. So one thing that we didn't mention is we also actually did an evaluation of this training. So, we hired an organization to come in and interview everyone who did the training and listen to the podcast and then give us some feedback on it. And definitely the big takeaway is openness, right? Is that people understand as soon as they join that, like, listen, this job is going to be really tricky and you're not going to be successful if you do it on your own. You have to, from the first day, be willing to commiserate with everyone on your team and strategize with everyone on your team, or you're just going to hit a wall. So that's been the big takeaway. I think the other one is just, I think performing at a higher level, right? Because instead of having to go in right away with no background about what to expect, people are far more prepared that first meeting. So I think we're seeing a high, the onboarding time has shrunk a little bit, right? So what used to take a month, it actually took several months, right? Like 1 to 2 months to get people like ready. I'm seeing that they're listening to the trainings, they're doing some other exercises, they're shadowing one trip, and then they're going out.
Wow.
So it's been a very effective in the amount of time that it takes to onboard someone.
Yeah. time saver. That's great. Was there another question that you had mentioned, Kaija? Yeah.
This one is from Bob, and he says, how do you get stories from your data users? In my work as an open data publisher, it sometimes feels as if we have no way of knowing how people are actually using data. These stories are valuable in fundraising and making the case for more investment in data sharing.
Yeah.
Well, Bob, you've just hit the nail right on the head there. That's really where we are right now is how do we get the stories out of the people who are using the data portal? And it's not, that's a hard thing. And I'd love to hear from you, Jerome, like how you think we can do that. I mean, one way we're going to try is while we're collecting the data, we've built a lot of relationships at the county level. So not only we're collecting data, but it's also this sort of cool, almost like grassroots marketing. So we're collecting data to populate the portal, and then we have this relationship. So one way we could do this is to go back and say, hey, remember me? We met a year ago. We had a great conversation. The data portal is live. Now can you tell me about how you're using it? And we have cultivated a handful of stories, actually, where we've met practitioners who are using the data in a great, tangible way. We've, I think we've really tried our best to express our thankfulness to them and be really genuine and authentic about how much it means to us that they're using this data and they're invested in data-driven change. So we encourage them to attend panels with us, participate in speaking engagements. We've recorded them telling their stories. And I think we'll just continue to do that over the next several years. But yeah, it's so important to get you stories. I think it's probably our number one priority right now. So.
Right. I mean, it's a great question because it's kind of like, so how do you mirror your own process internally of capturing these stories so that people can learn about how to do their job? But then how do you do that in for the external world as well? So in other words, you're meeting all these people who have the data, and then you've got, how do you get their stories of how they're using your portal, how they're using the information that you're giving back to them. And I think one of the things that I took away from working with you guys is that, on different kind of levels, whether it's internal or external, is also, sort of the intention or the invitation, the intention of the invitation, right? So it's kind of like, why, similar to our process of asking, well, why do you want to tell a story and why now? It's kind of like, why do we want to get this data and how is it going to benefit you? The person who's actually giving me the data or who may use this data. And I know that's a challenge that you guys have come across, is being able to express that, right? Is to say, that it's actually beneficial and that, it's not just for us. And I know that very recently, I think you guys had an experience in Florida where it definitely felt like, it's not about us, Measures for Justice, but it's about you and how these stakeholders really kind of got that. And that once you get that permission, or that sense of, oh, I understand what's in it for me now, then you're much more likely to get those use stories, right? So there's a little bit of work to do, before simply sending out a survey or, because you have to kind of,
and it might be super obvious to say this, but you really need to cultivate the relationship, before you ask for someone's story. Because though you and I like sharing stories, and there are people who go to Moth and tell their stories all the time, a lot of people don't, so you have to really make them feel comfortable in that environment and want to share.
Yeah, and I think from my perspective of just methodologically, it's again thinking about listening, right? Who's the person that's listening to you? What is perhaps getting in the way of their ability to listen to you? There might be something in the background of their listening that's just like shutting down because of something that's not really related to you, but maybe is related to the idea of what you're doing.
Definitely.
And so how do you, if you're aware of that, as the person kind of interacting with them, then you're better able to respond to them and to address their concerns and their needs. And only then, after you've done that kind of background work, can you really ask someone for their story.
Totally.
And it mirrors our process in a way, because I remember you and I talking quite a lot before you got to tell your stories, right? And
it was very
you had
nerve-wracking, and I was doing it voluntarily, and I was still like, oh my god,
right. And you had stories that were readily available. But even when you have those stories readily available, you really have to kind of sit down with the person and just listen to what the intentions are, what the purpose is, what the challenges are, And only then can you sort of get into the details of the story, I think.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, if you jump in right away, you're not going to get that critical kind of information that you really need, which usually has something to do with an emotional moment at some point or something. And when I say emotional, I don't mean like, somebody has to cry,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
like
yeah.
there's a kind of a turning point that happens, or, it's something that you remember because you remember the feeling of it, right? And so what are those moments? And I feel like you have to kind of work your way towards that. It doesn't just, people aren't just voluntarily dropping those moments.
Yeah, no.
There's some vulnerability there. So something to work with. Any other questions? And then I think maybe one or two questions, and then we'll wrap up. We can wrap up with some final points and some contact information.
Nope, that's all the questions. But
Okay.
Bob just wanted to follow up. He said, thanks. That's the approach we're taking in Pittsburgh at the Western PA Regional Data Center. And we're also learning from the Data Refugee Storytelling Project at UPenn.
Oh, wow.
I know this through NIP, and I'd like to follow up. So
Great.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'd be very
Hi from
interested
Bob.
in hearing that. Great. And so then, so what you're seeing on your screen now is the contact information for Measures for Justice. And, what I was told by people, and you can say, Caroline, if there's anything else that you would like people to do, but definitely go check out their website. I think people can now check out this portal, right?
Yeah.
And so you can sort of see, maybe perhaps how many states are you in now?
So we're in 6 states: Washington, Utah, Wisconsin, Florida, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania, for Bob. And over 350 counties, and we'll be adding Missouri and Arizona shortly, and are currently collecting data and collecting news stories in California.
Great. And this has happened in how long a period of time?
Oh gosh, about 4 years.
4 years. So it's a pretty good clip there.
Yeah.
Adding more states per year.
Exactly.
That's good. So that's great. So yeah, check out their website. There's their social media information there as well. In terms of contacting Narrative, you can definitely email me directly, jerome@narrative.com. You can also find us on social media. And I would just say, we thrive on feedback. And so if you have any questions as you digest this, perhaps as you watch the replay of this, and as you look at the slides that we're going to be sharing with you after this, which will sort of summarize our discussion points as well as how we implemented this program, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're here to listen to your concerns and challenges. It can't be too small or too big. Any ideas that you have, please bring them to us. We're always happy to connect with people. So thanks everyone for listening to us. I just want to remind you that our book, Powered by Storytelling, is coming out on April 27th, and you can already pre-order it on Amazon. And other than that, we'll be sharing information about our next webinar, which will be sometime in April as well. So we'll keep you on board. If you want to learn more about all of our programs and upcoming events and webinars, please sign up to our mailing list on our website. It'll probably pop up on your screen when you go to our website for the first time. Just put in your email, and that way you'll receive all of our events. We have our partners in London who are running a workshop this month, at the end of the month. So please definitely go and check them out. They are on the homepage of our website under workshops. All the information is there. You can also find them on Twitter at Narrative London. Their names are Dan Milne and Jane Nash, and we work together all the time. So if you are calling us from the UK and you want to reach out, or if you're listening to us from the UK or watching from the UK, you should reach out to them for sure. Okay, so all that info is on the website. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating. Thank you, Caroline, for taking time out and being here. And we'll say hi over here to our friends, I think, on Facebook and Twitter, right? Yes. So great. Thanks, everyone, for watching and for listening. Again, find Caroline Sarnoff at Measures for Justice and myself at Narrative, N-A-R-A-T-I-V. And we look forward to hearing from you again. Thanks so much, Caroline.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
We're out. Okay. That was fun. Great. Thank you so much. That was awesome.
Well